Hey, everybody, welcome back to the show. I cannot even believe how good this episode is. I'm so excited to share this with you. In fact, it was so good, we had to partway through, we decided, you know what? We're going to end it early and do a multi-part series because we had already talked almost 40 minutes or so, and I was like, there's just way too much still to get to. And my guest today was super willing to do that. He said, let's get back on another call or two. So this may end up being a 2-part, a 3-part. I don't know. He is welcome on anytime. My guest today is Jon Beazley. And Jon is what we call an apologist, which basically is somebody who makes arguments for or defends something kind of controversial, in this case, biblical truth. And so we start off with a very basic question, but an important one of like, why do you believe there's a God? How is it possible that there is a God, and what does that look like? And so we were gonna go from how do you know there's a God to Jesus and all this other stuff, and we couldn't even get there in time because there was just so much really great content. So really excited to share this episode with you. So buckle up and just put on your thinking cap a little bit if you're driving. Try to focus on the road and a little bit on this. But as best you can, kind of stay tuned and pay attention because this is going to be an episode filled with a lot of information. We jump around a little bit, and that's because I thought we were going to only have this one shot at it, but he was so kind and gracious. He said, I'm happy to come back. So we'll get him on again to kind of help us walk through this even more. So if you have friends, family members that maybe don't believe in God or they don't believe in the God of the Bible or Jesus, this is an episode that'll help you understand how to talk to them about those things. And so we're going to walk through that together starting in this episode. So stay tuned. But first, a word from our sponsor. Today's sponsor is Ashka Adventures, and let me tell you, Ashka Adventures is a series of children's books that were written by Deb Glenn, who's an author and a keynote speaker, and she's also a part of our church, and the books are amazing, but what's really exciting is that now she's written a feature-length animated film, and it is really close to going to production, and I cannot wait for this to happen. This is going to be a great family-friendly movie that I'm going to want all of you to see, so we're going to start pushing it right now. And here's the description. Join Ashka, the littlest sled dog, and her friends as they embark on an epic adventure through the wilds of Alaska's backcountry. 2 diverse teams of sled dogs come together for a common good with purpose-driven passion, persistence, wit, and humor to save the day in a race against time. Their challenging journey takes them over the Talkeetna Mountains, across breathtaking spires, through dazzling shards of glacier ice, down iceberg-laden rapids, and fighting through binding blizzards too near treacherous drop-offs. Get ready for an animated adventure like no other, where the wolf, the wind, and the wild come to test even the mightiest of sled dogs. The scenery is magical, the suspense will have you holding your breath, the comedy and frivolity will make your jaws hurt. Learn more at ashkaadventures.com. So, Jon, I know you would claim to be a Christian, which is great. I claim the same thing. But a lot of people say that, and a lot of people mean different things when they say that. So for the sake of just making sure everybody knows where we're starting from in this conversation, what are some of the foundational things that you believe when you say you're a Christian? What do you mean when you say that? And just kind of give me a 30,000-foot view of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's great to begin with kind of the big meta narrative of Scripture and how it portrays the Christian faith. And at the heart of this story is obviously mankind was created by God and in His image, and something happened subsequently to that to that creation story where mankind fell into sin. And it fractured that relationship, and we see that the brokenness of that relationship pretty much in every relationship, fracturing everything in our world. And so a Christian worldview views, hey, the reason why the world is the way that it is and all of its brokenness is because of ultimately a broken relationship with God. But God did not abandon His creation. He loved His creation, and He sent Jesus to die on the cross. And through his death, burial, and resurrection, He's actually carrying out His redemptive plan, which ultimately is a recreation. There was a creation, there was a fall, and this redemption is going to culminate not only with a new humanity, but also a new heaven and a new earth. He's going to restore what has been broken. And so I really view everything through this creation, fall, redemption. That would be a Christian perspective. Now, what we'll get into, I'm sure, is how do you know that's the right worldview? or the right perspective. But that's
Yeah.
at a 30,000 foot glance.
Well, and that's kind of what I was going to start off with. When you even when you read from Scripture, like Scripture agrees with the statement I'm about to make in Matthew chapter 7, that broad is the way that leads to destruction, and narrow is the path to truth, and few there be that enter in. So, like the amount of people that actually come to know Christ, the Jesus of the Bible that you worship, few people actually agree with you. In the grand scheme of the historical narrative, most people disagree with this concept of God the Father sends his Son to die on a cross to save us from our sins. Now, I agree with you. Just to be clear at the outset of this, I'm going to kind of play the opposing argument to try to help understand where you're coming from, so that you can try to help us with this. But most people disagree with you. So I guess the most basic question I would start with is, how do you know? And I know we can go into a lot of more nuance, but how do you know?
Yeah, and that's a phenomenal question. And when it comes to the subject, I'm going to use a big word here for a moment, but it's the subject of epistemology. This is like how do we know anything, right?
Yep.
When we come at obtaining or acquiring knowledge, it's important for us to be careful about using terms of certainty about anything. Like if I asked you, Matt, like, how certain are you that you're in your church? Well, you have pretty good evidence around you that you're recording. I think you said you're recording in your church, right? Is that the space where you record? Okay, great. You have some good evidence to it. But if I just said, well, how do you know that you know? How do you know that you're not in, people could use the whole like matrix concept, right? How do you know that this isn't just the matrix?
Multi-thousand-year-old argument of, is this all a dream? This has been discussed and debated for centuries.
And so when we talk about knowing things, we're talking about we're compiling the evidence to what is the most reasonable, probable explanation for things. Yeah. And so when we talk about knowing that Christianity is true, well, surely you could just keep asking the question over. Well, how do you know that you know that you know that it's true? And a part of living in this life in the way that God has set up things is that we are to live by faith. And so there is an element, if we're living by faith, there's an element to where there's a mystery to where I'm not going to be able to provide this is the definitive proof for the existence of God. However, what I think you could see is that you can see evidence being built up, almost like a cumulative case that's being built, that when you put all of those pieces together, the evidence, in my estimation, greatly outweighs the evidence that there is no God. But the way that you argue for this, first, and this is what you would call classic apologetics, you usually first argue for just theism. How do I know there's a God as opposed to being no God?
Right.
And then you have to go from theism to Christian theism. And so, like, for instance, if I brought to you like a classic cosmological argument, so I'm sure you're maybe familiar with that terminology, but just for those who are listening, cosmological argument deals with like the first cause of the universe. So everything that we see, the physical world, all of those things are contingent, meaning there's a cause to them, right? So everything that begins to exist has a cause. Pretty much.
John, I was listening to a guy the other day, though. He actually, and I've not really heard too many people use this argument. I think I know what my answer is, but I'm curious what you would say. He actually said if you use that argument that all that exists had to have a cause, then you'd also have to back it up and say that God himself had to have a cause, and that cause had to have a cause, and it's just this perpetual need of a cause.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that's actually used by like guys like Richard Dawkins, Hitchens, some of the new atheists has propounded that type of argumentation. The problem with that is that we're actually dealing with the physical world. So God would be metaphysical, not physical in that. So notice the precise language here. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. By definition, especially when you're dealing with, the Christian or the like Judeo-Christian God. You're talking about someone that pre-existed time. Matter of fact, let me just give you the full cosmological argument. And there are other arguments. This isn't the only one, but this is one of the best, I think, to grasp. There are other arguments for God that are really complex. Actually, it can make you go, wait, what are we saying? Because they're really difficult. But this one is I think, a pretty easy one. But the way it goes out is, number one, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Then the second premise in the syllogism is the universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause. Now, that doesn't quite get you at, okay, something caused the universe, but why do we conclude that it was God? A God figure. And so basically, if you break down the components of the universe, like including time, space, matter, most components would be kind of broken down into those sections, categories. So whatever caused the universe must be not those physical entities. So instead of being time bound, it would be eternal. Instead of it being in space, it would be spaceless. Instead of it being material, it would be non-material. And there are other people that talk about, make an argument that it would have to be personal, non-personal. I do think there's some wiggle room on pushing back against these ideas. But basically, when you kind of add this up, there was a cause that was eternal, spaceless, non-material, and personal.
Yeah.
You begin to say, okay, what kind of a entity does that describe? And the best explanation, I'm not saying it's the only explanation, but the best explanation to put in that spot would be God himself.
Because there would be some that would be non-Christian or at least non-Jesus believers that would argue the case for some form of intelligent design. Whether they would claim it as God or not, or the God of the Bible at least.
Yeah, so like the Kalam cosmological argument actually was started by somebody that was of the Islamic faith. So that's so they made an argument for God. Now, we would actually agree with the argumentation for just theism, but now we would argue differently with them when it comes down to who is this God? How has he revealed himself? Or has he revealed himself? Because you could have, like a deist believes that there was a God who created the world, but walked away from it, not engaging with it anymore. So, but a theist, in particularly Christian theism, we obviously believe that God is very involved in our world. So, and there's different argumentations for as we get into those layers. But that's a basic cosmological.
Not long ago, I was reading a book by Dr. John Frame. I forget the name of the book off the top of my head, but it's a bazillion pages thick. And it really just was so impactful to me as I was reading this, because he talks about not only must there be logically a God, some being out there, but he was using the word transcendence, that there's this being that transcends all of, just like you talked about time, space, and matter. He transcends all of those things. But then he also uses the word immanence, and he says not only is he and he was talking about it more in the concept of truth, in that not only is he the absolute source of truth, but he's also knowable. So it's not just logically, he concludes, there is this being that supersedes all of this stuff, that is outside, is not bound by any of this, because that's believable. But then what would make him want to be intimately connected to us? And that's that immanence, that fact that Christ came. I was teaching my church recently, even the idea of Emmanuel, God with it. Like he came to be with us, which is significant, because just because there is something that created doesn't necessarily mean he is knowable. But in our case, we believe that he is.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the philosophical conversation, like Aristotle, he's the one that kind of suggested the idea of there being an unmoved mover, or an uncreated person or thing that created the cosmos. And in the with Plato, Aristotle, they would often use the term logos to describe this entity. Now, logos in that particular time, in the Greek literature, they would talk about logos as being an impersonal force. And in Jewish literature, they would use that, hey, God actually created the worlds with his word, and they would use a derivative of that, or not a derivative, but a similar term in Hebrew. I shouldn't say derivative because Hebrew came first, but they would use a term that would say that, yes, the world was brought into existence by the word of God, but when John wrote his gospel, he said, hey, it wasn't just the words of God as an extension of God, but rather Jesus is this Logos. Yeah. He is the one who's created it. And the way that John frames it is that he's actually stepping into this long discussion, this philosophical discussion of what is the origin of everything. Well, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos.
Yeah.
Which I find interesting. I don't know if you follow Jordan Peterson very much, but
a little bit,
he's definitely jumped on. He's a psychologist that's, followed by millions of people, but he's been captivated by this idea of Logos, and it's captivated a lot of people's thoughts. But yes, I mean, even this is not just a Christian thing. It's just not like a bunch of Christians saying, hey, we believe that obviously the Bible says in the beginning God created heaven and the earth, so we're going to make up this argument. No, Christians actually have come to these philosophers that have already been talking about this type of argument. They're like, this moves back to an unmoved mover.
Yeah, and I love that you brought it up because I think sometimes we disconnect philosophy from theology, and they so often, just like with science and the Bible actually prove each other. Accurate science and biblical truth prove each other, and good philosophy and theology are interesting to bring together. I used to kind of be like, I knew Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, all of this stuff. I knew kind of about them, but they seemed almost mythical. But then when you actually realize a human timeline, like they existed, and so like I'm studying and teaching through the book of Colossians right now in my church, and when Paul's writing to the church at Colossae, he's addressing some of the thoughts that had been passed down from generations from men like this. Like it's the continuing conversation, right? We're bringing theology to bear on some of these questions that have been asked for thousands of years.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think it was I'm trying to think. I think it was in the 1949, somewhere around there, when the term Big Bang began to be popular, talking about the origin of the universe. I think it was Fred Howell that coined the term Big Bang. And but it's interesting when they track after realizing that, hey, the universe is just expanding. There's this expansion of the universe, and they begin to study that everything came from what they call the singularity, this initial singularity, the edge of space-time itself. Yeah. And what's interesting is they can trace the physical world all the way back to the singularity, but they can't go past it. It's like they can't quite get over. So everything, all the tools that science gives can only help us test the physical world. And so when they come back to this moment, the singularity, it's just kind of like, it's a mystery. Something, this came out of nothing. And so what we're saying as Christians is that actually what science is moving us towards is this single act of creation. Now, can we prove that? Not proof in the sense of a science experiment proof, because remember, science can't go past this point. But what is the best explanation? Because everything in our universe has a cause to it. We can look at something and we don't just say, oh, that just kind of happened. So why then is the best explanation? Hey, everything actually has a cause, and there was, a direct cause for that particular thing. Why do we go back to the beginning and saying, oh, but that just happened because there was nothing? It just doesn't seem to follow logically, right? Logically, what makes the best sense is that there was some type of creator. Now, again, there's other explanations. And what would be kind of a fun topic too, there's also, multiverse theories and things of that nature that can be fun to get into.
And what's interesting with those, that you bring that up, like when I started the church I'm at now, I was working full-time at a factory, and I had some really good friends with good conversations that did not believe like me. They were not believers. And there was one girl in particular who we had fascinating conversations about. And so, like, when you say there's ideas like that, I think some, especially people that have grown up in Christianity, might think, oh, okay, maybe there's a few crazy people out there. But those are, like, there's a lot of people that really believe these kind of things, these multiverse things. I mean, I've heard that from more than one person in my little town working at a factory putting together dehumidifiers where they're talking about this stuff with knowledge and an education on it. So it's fascinating to me what we kind of go through. And I think as Christians, we can't just discredit other people's beliefs and just say, well, that's just crazy, because we have to learn how to actually kind of refute those things. Otherwise, their arguments can, at some level, be almost just as legitimate as ours. The one thing that I always push back on people, though, is that first cause. Because when I've talked to people like, well, the Big Bang, okay, where did the stuff come from? Well, particles, where do those come from? From here, and then I've literally had people say this, and I don't mock them when I say it on a podcast like this, because I'd love for them to listen to this conversation. I don't want them to feel like they're being mocked, but I've literally had people say, well, maybe it came from aliens. Okay, cool. I'll give you that. Where did they come from? You know, so at some point, there has to be something that caused.
Yeah, sure. And another thing, I just for our audience say too, that when we're reading the scriptures, like for instance, in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. Like the whole cosmology of like ancient Israel was not anything close to what we know when it comes to how the universe works, and just and what we can tend to do is we can read back our cosmology and what we know about the universe back into their minds.
Yeah.
And we can make the scriptures say almost more than what they're intending to say.
Sure.
Like the Bible is not saying in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that, hey, this universe that began to exist, we can't argue from the Hebrew that, oh, hey, this is where everything in the whole world, the whole universe is, all of it together, this is when it began. It's actually quite possible reading that when it says in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, it could have been talking about just the universe as we know it, but it doesn't necessarily rule out a multiverse idea, is what I'm trying to say. And actually, we could probably get into this at another time too, but and I am definitely no scholar on this particular topic, but there are a lot of Christians and Christian philosophers and scientists that have made good arguments that still follow a cosmological argument, like everything begins to exist as a cause, but with a multiverse view in mind too. So you don't have to kind of go, the only Christian view is this, initial singularity that exploded everything. There could be, because you do have, even right now, scientists proves there are galaxies that, fold into a black hole and then explode into, another type of galaxy, type of thing. So could that have happened with our universe? Could there be a universe that actually exploded our universe into thing? But it would still trace back to what was the origin of all of those things. You know what I mean? We would just trace the argument back. And there's there's some arguments people say, well, the universe has always existed. And that kind of gets you into some absurdities when you think about argumentations. And is it possible? Maybe, but not really probable. And if again, you're going back to what makes the most sense of the data, that actually the universe did begin at this initial singularity. And actually the science right now lines up with that initial singularity. These other hypotheses are not quite mainstream. And that doesn't mean that we as Christians shift with the mainstream. But I do think that we should always, when we hear science or whatever it is, history, science, we should always say, hey, let me re-examine to make sure that I understand this appropriately. It's not that we're adjusting to the ebb and flow of what popular culture says is true. Yeah, but we also, as Christians, we just chase the truth down. We're not afraid of the truth. We believe that the natural world is going to line up with God's revelation, because he is the originator of both. He is the creator. He's also the originator of divine revelation, right?
Sure.
So we seek to line these up. And it's interesting. This brings me to Thomas Aquinas. Are you familiar with his work? He said in his day, people said, and this is when the scientific revolution began to take place and start to pick up some steam. The church would say, well, there's science truth and there's religious truth. Let's not worry about reconciling.
Yeah.
And Thomas Aquinas, he said, no. These are both from God. So we should seek to reconcile them. If there's a contradiction, you either have bad science or you have bad religion.
Yeah.
Meaning that, hey, we're actually not understanding this appropriately, so we need to go back to the drawing board. And I do appreciate that particular perspective. But anyways, I've kind of chased that rabbit. That was fun. Thank you.
Oh, I love that. Well, and I love that. But so, because I think sometimes we get, as Christians, we can get really dogmatic on it has to be this. And I think sometimes maybe we grew up, those maybe that grew up in a Christian school kind of have this is what I learned in my Christian school about creation. Those that grew up in a public school kind of have heard both. And then there is, and at some level, I think we have to look at it and go, some of this we may not have all of the answers on, but it doesn't affect our faith. It doesn't affect the source of truth and the source of beginning. But let me ask you this. If we go to this concept that there is a cause, there's a first cause, and that first cause is not bound by time, space, and matter, that he's outside of all that, he or she or it, and I mean that in the sense, okay, you got me there. There's something that created it. You still have a long ways to go before you're a sinner going to hell, and Jesus is the child of a virgin woman because of this God you claim started this whole earth, and I have to give my life by faith to him. Like that's a leap. So at least on the outset. So walk me through some of that.
Yeah. So just to back up and make sure for people who are listening in. So what we've been talking about so far is what's called natural theology. So cosmological argument is natural theology, which means we're taking the creation and we're building a view of God. Not necessarily the Christian God yet, but just God.
Right.
We're saying, hey, we believe that God is the best explanation for the creation. And then you can go from a cosmological argument to like a teleological argument. Like the word teleological comes from the Greek word telos, which is the end or purpose. We begin to look at the intricacies of creation. So not just everything that began to exist as a cause, but all these things actually have an intricate order to them. And there seems to be a designer behind these particular things. And this order is pretty consistent. So this is what some philosophers call the fine-tuning of the universe. Okay, so it's not just everything begins to exist as a cause. Now all of these things that exist has a particular way they relate to each other, and this is why we can have natural laws.
Yeah.
And so that looking into those natural laws is going to begin to pack on more evidence. Again, it doesn't bring us to, like this definitive proof, but we're like, wow, here's the universe has a cause, there's order, there's design, and embedded within all of us seems to be, and this kind of moves us to the axiological argument, which is the moral argument. We all have a sense of purpose ourselves, a sense of meaning. We crave this particular meaning, and we cannot live apart from moral intuition and also further moral obligation. And so now we're getting into the essence of our own being, our own ontology, who we are. And we think about these, just how everyone, atheist, Christian, theist, whatever, we all believe in that there's good and that there's evil.
Why?
Now, when we try to...
That's just innate within us?
Yes. And so what's the best explanation for the sense that we're these creatures that have moral intuitions? And if you get on Twitter, you find a lot of people who have these a strong sense of moral obligation, you know?
Yeah.
Like today we live in a culture that really cries out, this is just, or this is
Right.
unjust. This is good. This is evil. How could you say that? That is a very evil practice. But if you really, pan out and ask, well, what's your definition of good and evil?
Yeah.
Like, how do you ground what is justice, you know? And if you come from evolutionary perspective, there is no ground for morality. There's
Yeah.
nothing that grounds it. Morality would be only a product of, they would say, of our evolutionary development
It's like a social
and
construct.
social. Exactly. But first, our being able to have the cognitive ability
Yeah.
to going back to just communication and forming thought and forming opinions, and this is all going through an evolutionary process. But then it's a social construct. But this means that they would have to come to the conclusion that what is moral and right now will not be moral and right years down the road or
Well,
centuries ahead.
so let
Because, like,
me
for instance, like Aristotle,
go ahead.
Aristotle believed that that not every person was created equal.
Yeah.
Like, he would look at a slave and say he's obviously not created equal. People who have a higher capacity for changing society and they're the big movers, well, they have more value. Well, if you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, he's got a point,
Sure.
right? It's like they bring more value, therefore they should, they actually possess a greater value. So it's actually Christian thought that has laid the basis for secular thought today.
Yeah.
So a secular impulse for justice, for equality, that actually began with a Christian underpinning. Now, obviously, we wouldn't agree with all the rhetoric around their
Sure.
articulation of justice, but the very sense and desire for it really came from Christianity.
Well, and I want to keep
So,
down that
anyways,
path a minute because
yeah, I'm
w-
trying to track us to the
no,
Christian
and that's
theism,
good. So
but
here's what I'm
I'm
going to do.
talking
We
about
didn't talk about this before, John, but can I just ask? Can this be part one? And we'll keep talking about this, and we'll do a part two later, and we'll get more into the Jesus of the Bible. Let's stay kind of on God and morality, and let's kind of build this case a little bit, and then we'll jump back on another call, and we'll continue that story because I don't want to rush through this because I think this is important. I think understanding because this is a big issue I have. I've been working through a lot of stuff with my own church, trying to understand this concept of truth. Paul talks about it a lot in Colossians, not being swayed by false ideas and empty deceits and whatnot. And what was happening in the church of Colossae, which is what we've been working through verse by verse, is that there were a lot of these Gnostic and these extra biblical philosophical ideas that were coming into the church, and he's warning them how to kind of stay away from it, being rooted and built up and established in your faith and some of those things. And so and all of that's great, but there's this sense in everybody that I talk to, whether they're a believer or not, and I can't get a good answer from people. Why can't I do whatever I want? Because if you even take secular philosophy, if you take Freud, for example, and he says the greatest pleasure for man is sexual pleasure, and so the pursuit of that is going to bring you the most fulfillment. But even that leads down a path that it's the survival of the fittest. If I want to be with this person, then I get to dominate them, and it always leads down a path that doesn't actually make logical sense in the end.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I struggle with that
So,
because I think as Christians we can look at it and say, okay, we believe this by truth, but take Christianity off the table for a minute. We live in a world. You're 100% right. We live in a world that is all about, in a postmodern world, this concept of truth is my truth versus your truth. And as long as my truth is not part of some hegemonic power and suppressing your truth or oppressing your truth, then we can each have our own truth and all this stuff. Like, where does this come from, and how do we flesh this out and work through it? Because everybody seems to have a different opinion on it.
so your question being, if I can rephrase it, is like,
Because that was terribly
how do we?
phrased, I admit.
No, you're fine. You're fine. But so you're just trying to get down to the fact of how do we get at what truth is?
Well, sort of. But what I want to do is we believe that there's this eternally existent thing that created all of us. And so now we're jumping into inside everybody is this sense of right and wrong. And I want to dive into that a little bit. What would a secularist say this sense of right and wrong comes from? Why aren't they why aren't like what's the logical argument for why that can't be true? Because okay, yes, I want to convince them that Christianity is true, but I think sometimes in order to do that, I've also got to convince them that there's holes in their own argument.
Exactly. So that brings us up to a really great train of thought. If I can digress just a little bit.
Please, yeah.
And I'm going to tie this into the idea of apologetics as well. So what we've been occupying ourselves with is we've been trying to get at like almost philosophical arguments for God.
Yeah.
But if you trace Christianity and apologetics and them getting at trying to kind of win a culture to Jesus, so Jesus being that truth, Jesus
Right.
says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. But if you see the church, when they begin to spread the gospel through the first century, there were different isms in that era that confronted Christian truth. For instance, like Gnosticism presented a worldview that would present that actually Jesus could not have come and become a human because all of the material world is evil, the spiritual world is good, and it was posing a threat to the gospel, but also how the gospel plays itself out. Because a Gnostic said, hey, you can live in sexual immorality as long as your spirit's fine, because the body is going to be sinful, but your spirit can be right. They were creating this dichotomy. And the Christians were coming in saying, no, that does not bring human flourishing. I'm using kind of current terminology here.
Sure.
But they would preach the gospel, and then they would articulate it carefully depending on the isms. So there was Gnosticism. They were also, if you look at Acts chapter 2, Paul was preaching the gospel in a Jewish context. So he used a lot of the Hebrew Bible to make his argument, to make his case. And Acts 2, the Pentecost sermon, was actually an apologetic. They says, hey, these men are drunk at the third hour of the day. And Peter's like, actually, that's not the best explanation for what's happening. The best explanation is this is a fulfillment of Joel chapter 2. And then he goes and points to Jesus through this whole sermon. Well, that's what Christians do in every type of era. We're trying to point to Jesus as the best explanation for that data. So they did it with in confrontation to Gnosticism and Judaism. When you get to more of them like the medieval era, you had the rise of Islam. So John Damascus formed the first Christian apologetic against that particular teaching. And so they were obviously teaching an opposing idea of the God of the universe, and the whole how to view everything. And so there was an articulation towards that. And you also had getting into the beginning of the modern era, you had just the modern era was the rise of science and rationalism. And they began to create a dichotomy between religion and rationalism and science.
Right.
And I told her, and I am going somewhere with this, by the way.
No, I get it.
So there was a new type of ism. So the church began at first. There was this, like as I said, Thomas Aquinas addressed the church saying, "Well, you got religious truth and you got science truth. We won't reconcile." But he began to make a case, and if you study Thomas Aquinas, he's kind of the pioneer for arguments, these 5 arguments for the existence of God. So he had a cosmological argument, he had a moral type argument. He was laying these out, and they were really philosophical in nature, trying to prove just the existence of God and him being the basis of all things.
Yeah.
But as you move from modern era to now a postmodern era, the isms have fundamentally shifted.
Mm-hmm.
So in the modern era, they said religion can no longer answer how we find meaning and purpose in the universe.
Yeah.
So we need to use science and reason to find the meta narrative. So we're no longer going to use the Bible or religion or any of that. We're going to shift to science and reason. Mm-hmm. But what's happened in the modern era is they realized, hey, we've developed a lot in science and reason, and we're just as confused as ever. Matter of fact, guys like Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist, he says that postmodernity and its ideology of there is no absolute truth is absolutely destroying the fabric of society.
I would
and
agree.
He's not a Christian.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, he's a non-Christian, but he says that if we didn't have religion, then our whole society would crumble.
Even Karl Marx had held to a view similar to that, where he didn't agree with religion, but if it weren't for religion, everything falls apart.
Yes, so he saw the utility of it, right?
Yeah.
And so Jonathan Haidt makes this case, and he wrote a book called The Happiness Hypothesis, and he even makes the argument like people that were actually in church, in a community, even though they didn't have all the markings of like, this hedonistic life, ended up being more happy than someone who had access to all the type of things that you would put in that box, like, maybe a nice career, being in good physical shape, having a lot of money, all this type of things, but yet still being very unhappy, and sometimes even pushing towards being more suicidal because you've obtained something, but now you realize it didn't give me what I thought it would give me,
right?
Type of thing. So postmodernity, the big shift between modernism and postmodernism, they still have science and reason at one of their bases, but they've given up pursuit of a grand meta narrative.
Yeah.
So they actually all through history, all isms, all the way up to the postmodern era, everyone believed that there was a grand purpose behind the cosmos.
Yeah.
Modernity rejected like theism and said there's got to be something else.
Right.
Postmodern says there really isn't any ultimate meaning. There is no ultimate purpose. Matter of fact, the universe is expanding at a rate, and in about 1 million or so years, we're all going to burn up anyway. So don't try to find meaning, rather create it.
Yeah.
And actually, you can see that in how we talk about identity today.
Yes.
Because when we talk about identity, we're saying, hey, like, you can project onto yourself your own meanings for everything.
Right.
Even down to what gender do you want to be? You can decide. And see what that's doing is it's just decaying every type of fundamental that we have for human flourishing.
Yeah.
So this is where I would say that the ideal is to present for us is to actually, instead of classic apologetics would be answering people's questions. Well, here's the thing. They're not asking those questions.
Right.
They don't care.
They don't care anymore.
So before answering people's questions, we have to begin with questioning people's answers.
Yeah.
So we start with, now that sounds a little pushy, but what I mean is, hey, tell me about yourself. Like, what makes you tick? How do you find meaning and purpose? How do you find satisfaction? How do you ground your belief for justice? See what I mean?
Yep.
And when you get into those deeper level questions, people are going to realize I don't have much of a foundation for my own intuitions.
Yeah.
I have a moral intuition. I have a sense of wanting satisfaction. As a matter of fact, I use this sometimes. I was like, why do you think all the movies that we actually like or TV shows that we like, we want it to end good? Now, Beth and I were watching a show where, like, for several shows, the plot kept thickening and it kept getting worse.
Yeah.
And we were sitting there like, man, I hope this ends good. And that's kind of just the intuition for all of us. We have this intuition of we want it to end at the good, that happy ever after type scenario. For a naturalist, they all movies, all happy endings is not reality. It's just a fake. It's actually escapism.
Right.
We're escaping reality. We're not thinking more deeply about reality. We're escaping it.
Yeah.
But for a Christian, those happy endings actually just line up with what we believe the whole world is moving towards.
Yeah.
The new heaven and new earth. Every story arc that we like is this creation, fall, redemption happening over and over and over again. And why are we so bent on seeing the same story over and over and over again? It's because God's telling the story and we have an inner craving for it.
Yeah.
Now, you say, how do you prove that? I can't just prove that with one thing. But what we do is we build a case by saying, hey, look at the cosmological argument.
Yep.
Look at these natural theology arguments, which lead us now into more of who we are as human beings and how do we actually function and flourish as a society. And this is where we're starting it closer and closer and closer to the gospel, actually being the only answer that will save us from oppression in either way. There's oppression that comes through self-righteous people.
Yep.
So when people say, well, Christopher Hitchens said this, he said that religion poisons society. Well, in a sense, he's right. There's a lot of religion that poisons society.
Yep.
But we could also make the argument that a naturalistic worldview that removes all of truth is also a poison to society.
Well,
so you have religion and irreligion
today.
or non-religion. Right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that when you present the gospel, because it's all of grace, it doesn't make you an oppressive religious person that's manipulating people through some religious practices, nor does it lead you into hedonistic lifestyle that says life is all about me.
Yeah. I think I was reading
or
listening to a speech he gave, but I think it was Charles Taylor that was talking about what he calls the psychology of self. And when you kind of follow that rabbit trail, and a lot of the philosophers in the kind of postmodern era talk about this, it's this idea of, since there isn't significance beyond this, what is it that I can do that makes me the most happy? And the reality that's so devastatingly sad is that when I become whatever gender I feel like being, or when I give myself to whatever sexual pleasure I feel like giving myself to, or when I whatever that involves, those are kind of the big ones in society today. When I give myself to those things, there may be a certain sense of immediate satisfaction, but it's so empty. It's just leaving people hopeless, because I think you're right. There's this eternal something that we're all headed to as Christians. We believe new heaven and new earth. But without that, it is just living for the immediate, which ultimately leaves everybody empty and wanting for more. Well, Jon, I hate to do this because I'm enjoying it, but we're at about 44 minutes right now, and it's a great conversation. But if you're willing, I'd like to schedule another time to kind of pick up from here and continue our conversation, because I did not think it was going to be – I knew it was going to be great. I didn't think it was going to be this great. And so if you're willing, I'd love to jump back on with you in the not-too-distant future and continue this conversation, because I have to get to another meeting in a little bit. So I don't want to do a hard stop, and I don't think anybody wants to listen to it. I'm not Joe Rogan, so a 4-hour podcast probably isn't going to be super popular. But maybe we can split it up into a couple.
You just got to look a little bit more mean, lean into the mic a little bit.
I know.
Why do you
Shave
say
my head
that?
a little bit. He does, this kind of. Yeah.
We should invite Joe Rogan
kind of the
same.
same.
That's right. Yeah.
You know what? I would love to have a guy like Joe Rogan on a conversation like this, because, and I don't watch him a ton, but I think he's at least fair at listening to your viewpoint, and he'll challenge it, and he doesn't appear, from what I've seen, to be rude about it. And so, hey, Joe, if you're listening, which I doubt, we'd love to have you on. If anybody has a connection to Joe.
Same thing. Jordan Peterson too. I wanted to talk to him because he's so close to Christianity. His theology is a little crazy, obviously, but I'd love to talk to him. He's a brilliant guy.
I think I'm going to be at a conference that he's speaking at in a few months.
Oh, no way.
I'm hoping
totally
to at
jealous.
least get an opportunity to meet him.
Yeah,
he's a brilliant mind, and he's fascinating to listen to. Sometimes I'm just like, oh, you're so close.
Yeah. Well, I want to just say to your audience real quick, I like apologizing if this seems a little bit like we're jumping around. It's maybe not quite as sequential, but hopefully there's some nuggets of things that will just help you kind of think more deeply about laying out the Christian faith. And the thing that I really come back to is that as a Christian, you don't have to be a philosopher or this great historian. You really need to know the faith really well. So the scriptures, the faith, the articulation of the gospel, and be able to ask people questions, because they're only a few questions away from seeing that their worldview doesn't really work.
Yeah.
And then you present the counter narrative of the gospel, and you just show like, hey, this is what God has done in my life. Do you have absolute proof? Not definitive absolute proof.
Sure.
There's a faith element here. But look at how much it brings a sense of human flourishing and establishment. And I'll get into it next time. But I think if you can learn to do that, you can then begin to build out these other arguments for God that can help beef it up. But you start with that, the essential. So I'll stop there.
The jumping around is my fault. I kind of got excited about different things you were saying, and I kept taking you off course. So I apologize.
Oh,
for
yeah.
that.
It's fun, though.
Fun stuff.
It's good. It's a conversation.
Yeah. All right, man. Hey, I appreciate you being on. We'll get you on here shortly for part 2.
All right.
All right, guys.